It is a little after 10 in the morning on the 22nd of February, 1991, and the streetlights in Al Amadi are on. They have been on for 3 days. The sun rose an hour ago. Somewhere above the smoke, it is still climbing. At ground level, there is no shadow, no glare, no way to tell noon from dusk. Drivers heading south from the city keep their headlights burning and their windows sealed. Soot lands on the windscreen faster than the wipers can clear it. To the south, the horizon is not a line, it is a row of flames. 605 wells are burning. Some counts put it closer to 730. Nobody has been able to get near enough to be certain. The desert around them is filling with crude that never caught, pooling into shallow black lakes that will eventually number about 300. 5 million barrels a day are going into the air. That is more oil than most countries on Earth produce. It is being lost every day in smoke. 300 kilometers away, in Saudi Arabia, instruments recording sunlight report that the sky is delivering barely half of what it should. Soot is falling on snow in the Himalaya. Black rain is landing on farmland in Iran. And beneath the smoke sits a country of 2 million people that has, for the moment, no functioning government inside its own borders, no electricity, no drinkable water, and no income at all. Its single export is on fire. It will take 9 months and 11,450 workers from 38 countries to put the fires out. In that entire period, the state of Kuwait does not miss a single payment. Salaries reach teachers, nurses, soldiers, and students scattered across 3 continents. Hospitals are supplied, contracts are signed, money moves in enormous quantities out of a country that is producing nothing. It is able to do this because of a decision made 38 years earlier in a city 4,500 kilometers away by men who assumed the oil would run out. This is Kuwait. 17,800 square kilometers of gravel plain at the top of the Arabian Gulf. Flatter than almost any country on Earth. No river, no lake, no mountain worth the name. Rainfall of about 100 millimeters a year in a good year. And the first place in the world to look at a fortune coming out of the ground and ask in writing, what happens when it stops? In February of 1953, a small office opened in the City of London. It had a handful of staff and a single instruction. Take the money arriving from the Kuwaiti oil fields and put it somewhere that is not Kuwait. At that moment, Kuwait did not exist as a country. It was a protectorate under British administration. It had no seat at the United Nations, no constitution, no central bank, and no flag that any foreign ministry recognized. Independence was 8 years away. Oil had been flowing commercially for less than 7 years. The mandate, written for that office in 1953, used a specific word. The money was to be invested in order to reduce the country's reliance on a single, finite resource. Finite. In 1953, written by a government that had only just begun to be rich about a resource that was about to make it one of the wealthiest places per person on the planet. The man behind it was Sheikh Abdullah al-Salim al-Sabah, who ruled Kuwait from 1950 to 1965. He is remembered inside the country mostly for something else, for signing the Constitution of 1962. But the London office came first. That office is still open. It became the Kuwait Investment Office and later, in 1982, the Kuwait Investment Authority. It is the oldest sovereign wealth fund in the world, older than the state that owns it, and it now manages somewhere in the region of $1 trillion. Norway, the country most often credited with getting this right, would not create its own fund until 1990. The money left Kuwait before Kuwait did. Nobody in that London room could have known how much that would matter. 37 years later, it would be the only part of the Kuwaiti state still standing. Out on the gravel plains west of the city, in the hour after dawn, something else is calculating a long-term survival strategy. The dub emerges from its burrow. It is a spiny-tailed lizard, Euromastix aegyptia, and a full-grown adult is the length of a man's forearm, armored along the tail with rings of thick spines. It looks prehistoric because in structural terms, it very nearly is. The dihub is one of the few large lizards on Earth that is essentially a vegetarian. It grazes on desert plants, and it gets almost all of its water from them. It does not drink. In a country where surface fresh water simply does not occur, that is not a preference. It is the entry requirement. Its burrow does the rest. 2 meters down, the ground holds a temperature the surface will not see for another 6 months. The dihub emerges cold, flattens itself against the stone, darkens its skin to absorb heat faster, and only begins to feed once it is warm enough to digest. When the surface passes 50 degrees, it goes back down. Bedouin families hunted the dihub for centuries and ate it and knew exactly where the burrows were. What they took, the population replaced. It is the newer hunting, done from vehicles and without the old restraint, that the dihub has struggled to absorb. It is still out there in the early mornings, standing tall when cornered, chest pushed out, hissing at things far larger than itself. The city those planes run into began as something much smaller. Around 1716, families of the Bani Utub moved to a natural harbor on the northern Gulf and settled beside a small fort. The Arabic word for that kind of fort is Kut. The diminutive of Kut is Kuwait. The country is named after a building nobody thought was significant. What made the place work was the water in front of it, not the land behind it. Kuwait Bay is deep, sheltered, and sits at the top of the Gulf, which put it at the closing point of a sea route that ran to India, to Zanzibar, to Basra, and the Shatt al-Arab. For 200 years, that geography was the entire economy. And the specific thing they went to sea for was pearls. The waters of the Gulf produced the finest natural pearls in the world. The oyster, Pinctada radiata, sat on shallow banks that a free diver could reach on a single breath. By the beginning of the 20th century, Kuwait had roughly 700 boats working the pearl banks, crewed by around 15,000 men. In a town of perhaps 35,000 people, that is close to every able-bodied male. The season ran 4 months, from the middle of May to the middle of September. In the other 8 months, the same ships carried cargo to India and East Africa. So the town built ships as well, and Kuwaiti boom and bagla hulls became known across the Indian Ocean for being well made. Walk the safe waterfront today, and the boat-yays are gone. But in the workshop attached to the Maritime Museum, the old shapes are still laid down by hand, plank by plank, sewn and pegged the way they were before nails. The pearling economy also ran on debt and the debt was the point. A diver did not earn a wage. He took an advance from the nakuda, the boat captain, before the season began, and repaid it from his share of the catch. If the season was poor, the shortfall carried forward. It compounded. A man could dive for 30 years and owe more at the end than at the start. If he died, the debt passed to his sons, who then had to dive for the same captain to clear it. The work itself did what deep breath hold diving does to a body: ruptured eardrums, blindness. Divers went down with a stone to sink faster and a rope to be pulled back up 10 and 12 hours a day on dates and coffee and very little water because a full stomach shortened the breath. Contemporary British officials in the Gulf described the system in their own reports as slavery in everything but name. A Kuwaiti writer named Saif Marzouk al-Shamlan spent a large part of his life recording all of it: the diving laws, the names of the captains, the types of ship, and who owned them. He published his history of pearling in 1974, while there were still men alive who had done it, and he later fought the demolition of the old sitting rooms along Gulf Street, when the city was rebuilding itself in concrete. He was recording a world that had already ended, and he knew it. What ended it was not oil, it was Japan. In the 1920s, Japanese producers perfected the cultured pearl. A seeded oyster, farmed at scale, produced a gem that most buyers could not distinguish from a natural one, at a fraction of the price. The market for Gulf pearls did not decline, it collapsed. Then, the Great Depression removed what was left of the luxury trade. Within a decade, the fleet was idle. 15,000 men who had one skill found there was no longer any use for it. The debts did not disappear when the industry did. Families in Kuwait in the 1930s were selling doors and roof beams for food. That is the condition Kuwait was in when the drilling rigs arrived. Not a wealthy trading state that got richer, a bankrupt one, 10 years into a depression it had no way out of, that had just watched a single foreign technology erase its entire national income inside a decade. Everything Kuwait did with its oil money afterwards was done by people who had personally lived through that. There is a question underneath all of this that the pearls never answered. How does a town of 35,000 people drink? There is no river in Kuwait. There has never been a river in Kuwait. There is no permanent lake, no spring worth the name, and the groundwater across most of the country is brackish, salt enough to kill a crop, and in most places, salt enough to make a person ill. For the first 2 centuries, the answer was rainwater cisterns and a scatter of shallow wells, and the answer was never quite enough. A high-yield well found at Hawali in 1905 was significant national news. Then, after 1907, when the rains failed badly, Kuwait began doing something that almost no other country has ever had to do. It began importing water by ship. Dhows sailed north to the Shatt al-Arab, the river formed where the Tigris and the Euphrates meet, and filled their holds from the fresh current. At the peak, 49 large boats were making that run, carrying something in the order of 80,000 gallons a day. It was a national industry. In 1939, a company was founded purely to manage the fleet. When the boats reached the harbor, the water was sold on by porters with tanks and by men leading donkeys and camels through the lanes, calling out through the neighborhoods that the water had arrived. A town that drank a foreign river, delivered by sailing ship, house by house. So, when the oil money arrived, One of the first things Kuwait bought with it was the end of that dependency. In 1951, the oil company installed a small distillation plant at Mina al-Ahmadi. 2 years later, a far larger one opened at Shuwaik, on the western edge of the capital, producing about 1 million gallons of fresh water a day out of the sea. It made Kuwait the first country in the world to turn desalination into national policy. Not a research project, not an emergency measure. The permanent, planned method by which the state would supply drinking water to its citizens forever. Today, there are 8 plants along the coast, and around 90% of the water in Kuwaiti taps was seawater that morning. Every glass of it costs fuel to make. The country burns part of its one export in order to drink. 20 kilometers out from the capital, in the mouth of the bay, there is an island where the water question was answered a very long time ago and then unanswered. Failaka is small, 14 kilometers long, 6 across, and so flat that the highest ground on it stands about 7 meters above the sea. But it has shallow depressions that hold rainwater and that made it habitable when the mainland was not. People have been living on Failaka more or less continuously since the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The Dilmun civilization, centered on Bahrain, built a temple here. Their seals and their stone come out of the ground on the island still. Then, in the late 4th century before the Common Era, the fleet of Alexander the Great came down the Gulf under an admiral named Nearchus, and he put a garrison on it. The Greeks built a fortress and a temple to Artemis and called the island Ikaros. The name Failaka is thought by many to descend from the Greek word for an outpost. For 4,000 years, this flat scrap of ground was the most continuously occupied place in the country. In the 1930s, about 1,500 people lived there. By 1985, it was more than 5,800. There was a school, a bank, a clinic, a mosque, a ferry from Ras Al Ard in Salmiya, and a holiday complex on the southern shore with swimming pools and restaurants where families from the mainland spent their weekends. It is the 2nd of August, 1990. Word reaches the island in the early hours that the border has been crossed. Failaka sits directly in the approach to Kuwait Bay, and everyone on it understands within a day what that means. Boats leave for the mainland carrying what people can lift. Doors are locked. Keys are pocketed, the way you pocket a key when you expect to come back inside a week. Nobody comes back. The population of Failaka Island in the census of 2011 was 147. The village of Al-Zor is still there. The school is still there with the desks in it. The bank is still there. Ferries run again for day visitors, and people walk through the streets of a town that was abandoned inside 48 hours and never reoccupied. 40 kilometers from one of the wealthiest capitals on Earth. 4,000 years of continuous settlement ended in a morning and not resumed. North of Failaka, the sea gives way to something that is neither properly water nor properly land. Bouyan is the largest island in Kuwait, 863 square kilometers, which makes it bigger than several countries. Almost none of it rises 5 meters above the tide. On the highest spring tides, the sea comes across the flats and the island very nearly disappears. It was not made by Kuwait, it was made by Iraq and Turkey and Syria in a sense. Bouyan is silt, carried down the Tigris and the Euphrates over thousands of years and dropped where the Shat al-Arab meets the Gulf. The island is a delta that never fully hardened. Most maps of the region show it as blank. No settlements, No roads, no names. It reads as the emptiest place in a country that already looks empty. It is in fact the most crowded ground Kuwait has. The Mubarak Al-Kabir Reserve covers 50,948 hectares of those lagoons and salt marshes, and it was designated Kuwait's first wetland of international importance after the country signed the Ramsar Convention as its 169th member. Two separate migration corridors cross here, one running from Turkey down to India, the other from Eurasia into Africa. Between 2 and 3 million birds pass through Kuwaiti airspace in a year. The shallow water around the island is a nursery for most of the commercial fish in the northern Gulf. And on the mudflats, in the summer, there is a colony of a bird that does something no other bird of its kind does. The crab plover is a wader, about the size of a small gull, sharply black and white, with a bill heavy enough to crack a crab's shell in a single strike. Every other wader on Earth lays its eggs in a scrape on open ground. The crab plover digs a tunnel up to 2 meters into a sandbank and lays a single egg at the end of it in the dark. One egg, unusually large and unusually white, because in a burrow there is nothing to hide from and no reason to be camouflaged. The chick hatches underground and is fed by its parents for months, long after it can fly, which is close to unheard of among shorebirds. Birds tagged on the wintering flats of Bahr al-Hikman in Oman have been tracked north to these breeding colonies, following the coast for up to 3 weeks to get here. Some appear to cross open desert at night in the dark to avoid the heat. The largest breeding colony of crab plovers anywhere in the world is on Bouyan, on the island that the maps leave blank. Back on the mainland, the ground does finally lift. The Jal az-Zor escarpment runs above the northern shore of Kuwait Bay for about 60 kilometers, and at its highest point, it reaches 145 meters. In any other country, that is a hill nobody would name. Here, more than 90% of the land sits below 100 meters. Jal az-Zor is the closest thing the country has to a mountain range, and standing on it, you can see across the entire width of the bay. So what is it doing there, in a country with no tectonic drama at all? It is not a fold or a fault in the way a mountain usually is. It is layered sediment, wind-blown and marine, laid down and then cut into by water that no longer runs, exposing a cliff face of Oligocene and Miocene sandstone and gypsum roughly 36 meters high. Along its base runs Wadi al-Batin, a valley 5 to 10 kilometers wide that carries nothing at all for years at a time and then floods violently without much warning. The ridge does one more thing. In the early morning, migrating falcons line up along the edge of it, waiting. As the sun heats the rock face, thermals begin to rise off the escarpment, and the birds step off into them and are carried up without a wing beat. Steppe eagles do the same in autumn, in numbers. Below the ridge, the marshes at Jara are the largest wetland on the Kuwaiti mainland, and in a country of gravel and salt, they are the only place that is reliably green. Jara is also where, in 1920, the town fought off a far larger force from the south at a mud brick fort now known as the Red Fort. It still stands, low and square, on the edge of a suburb. That fight is the reason Kuwait built a wall around the city, and the wall is why the modern city has ring roads where it does. The gates are still there, 5 of them, standing alone in traffic islands, doors into a boundary that no longer exists. Beyond Bouyan, the country scatters into pieces. Waba lies at the very top of the Gulf, low and marshy, with almost nobody on it. al-Namil sits in the mouth of the bay and has given up Islamic-era finds to the archaeologists. Quba, Karoo, and al-Maradim are specks of sand and coral far to the south, and they matter because terns and Socotra cormorants nest on them in numbers that the mainland could never support. Inland, the southern dune fields hold something in the order of 2,300 mapped dunes, and the longest chain of them runs for 2.5 kilometers. The Mutla Ridge takes the high ground above the bay. South of the capital, at Shuaibah and Al-Zur, the coast turns into refineries, power stations, and desalination plants standing in a row, which is where the country's water and electricity are actually manufactured. But the ground that changed everything is inland and to the south, and from the air, it looks like nothing at all. The Greater Bergen Field covers roughly 1,000 square kilometers of gravel plain. There is no landmark, there is no visible feature. There are pipes and access roads and a low haze of heat. Beneath it is the second largest conventional oil field on Earth. Kuwait sits on something over 100 billion barrels of proven reserves, close to 6% of the global total, held in a country roughly the size of Wales. Drilling began at Bergen in 1937. In February of 1938, the well came in. Then, the war stopped everything, and the wells were plugged with concrete for 6 years in case they fell into the wrong hands. It is the 30th of June, 1946. At Mina al-Ahmadi, on a shore where there had been nothing at all, Sheikh Ahmad al-Jaber al-Sabah turns a silver wheel, and the first Kuwaiti crude runs down the line into a waiting tanker. Within 5 years, the country's income is unrecognizable. Within 10, Kuwait is one of the richest places per person in the world. The reason Bergen is so productive is worth understanding, because it also explains what happened in 1991. The field is naturally pressurized. There is a cap of gas sitting above the oil, pressing down on it, and the pressure is high enough that the crude comes up on its own. For decades, Kuwait barely needed pumps. Open the valve, and the field does the work. That is why the wells produce so cheaply. It is also why, when the wellheads were destroyed, the fires could not simply be starved. The field kept pushing fuel up into them. A burning well in Kuwait was not a fire that would eventually go out. It was a fire connected to a reservoir the size of a small sea, and it would burn until somebody physically capped the hole. Around the field, the oil company built Al-Ahmadi, a town for its workers, laid out in numbered blocks on a low ridge with a view down to the tanker berths. It has hedges and a golf course and street trees kept alive on desalinated water, and it looks less like the Gulf than like a piece of 1950s Britain set down in the desert. Out beyond the tanker terminals, on the small outer islands, there is a bird whose entire world is the same water those ships move through. The Socotra cormorant breeds almost nowhere except the Arabian Gulf and the seas immediately around it. It is a dark, long-bodied seabird, and it hunts in a way that is closer to a hunting pack than to a solitary diver. Flocks, numbering in the thousands, move along the surface in a rolling front, the birds at the back flying over the ones in front and dropping in ahead of them, so the whole mass advances like a wheel, driving the fish into shallower water where they can be taken. They nest in dense colonies on bare islands. That is efficient, and it is also the vulnerability. A single oil spill in the wrong month can take a substantial share of a regional population, and the Gulf is the most heavily trafficked oil water on the planet. In 1991, somewhere between 6 and 8 million barrels went into that sea. The slick reached shorelines 400 kilometers away. The colonies on Cuba and Karoo are still there, counted every year now, which they were not before. Back on the mainland, at the edge of the water in the capital, stand 3 towers that almost every photograph of Kuwait includes. They opened in 1979. The tallest is 187 meters. 2 of them carry spheres of blue and green enameled steel discs, and the main sphere has a restaurant and a viewing deck that turns slowly through a full rotation. They are read, almost everywhere outside the country, as decoration, a skyline signature, a postcard. They are water tanks. The lower sphere of the main tower holds 1 million gallons. The second tower is a reservoir in its entirety. They were built as part of a national water distribution network, along with dozens of far plainer storage towers scattered across the country, and the architects were asked to make the flagship group beautiful because of what it was, not in spite of it. A country with no fresh water put its water tanks on the waterfront and made them the national symbol. Something similar happens with the things Kuwaitis make with their hands. Sadu is the weaving of the Bedouin, done by women on a ground loom, a frame pegged out flat on the sand rather than standing upright. The wool comes from sheep, goats, and camels. The patterns are geometric, and they are not decorative in the way an outsider assumes. The motifs carry meaning, tribal affiliation, marital status, invocations of protection. A woven panel can record who a family is and where they have traveled, in a form that rolls up and goes on the back of a camel. It is a written language for people who moved. By the 1970s, it was close to gone. Settlement, wage work, and machine-made cloth had removed the need for it inside a generation. In 1979, a group of Kuwaiti women founded the Al-Sadu Society to stop that, and it has been led for years by Sheikha Bibi Duaij Al-Jaber Al-Sabah. They collected looms and old panels, brought in the weavers who still knew the patterns, and set them teaching. In 2020, Sadu weaving was inscribed on the UNESCO list of intangible cultural heritage. The pattern is now laid into the paving of the street outside the Sadu house in the capital, so that people walk over it on the way to work. And in 2025, UNESCO inscribed something less tangible still. The diwaniya is a room, usually attached to a house, often with its own door to the street, furnished with low seating around the walls. In the evening, it opens and men come in. Neighbors, relatives, colleagues, strangers brought by a friend. Tea and coffee are served. Nobody is invited and nobody is turned away. What is discussed there is everything: family matters, business, football, and politics, at length and without much restraint. During election campaigns, the diwaniya effectively becomes the campaign. Candidates in Kuwait have historically won and lost seats in these rooms rather than on billboards. Young men learn to sit in them by sitting in them. How to greet, where to sit, when to speak, how to disagree with an older man without insulting him. It is the most important political institution in the country that has no legal existence at all. Outside the city, at Wafra in the south and Abdali in the north, there is farmland. Not much of it, and it should not be possible. The soil is 80 to 90% sand. It drains almost instantly, and it carries almost no organic matter. The available groundwater is brackish. And yet, These are green blocks on the satellite image, growing dates, tomatoes, cucumbers, and fodder under shade netting, irrigated from wells whose water would kill most crops if the salt-tolerant varieties had not been selected for it and the volumes carefully managed. There are also two places in the north, at Routain and al-Aish, where genuinely fresh groundwater exists. Lenses of rainwater sitting on top of the heavier saline water beneath, recharged only by what falls. Between them, they yield about 9,000 cubic meters a day. 9,000 cubic meters in a country that consumes over 3 million. The natural water supply of Kuwait covers well under 1% of what Kuwait drinks. Everything else is made. Which brings the story back to the money and to what a country does with a fortune it does not trust. Kuwait became independent in June of 1961. 6 months later, in December, before the first anniversary of the state, it created something no developing country had ever created. The Kuwait Fund for Arab Economic Development opened with 50 million dinars, roughly $160 million at the time, and a mandate to lend that money to other countries on concessional terms. It was the first foreign aid agency in the world established by a developing nation. Think about the position Kuwait was in, independent for 6 months. A generation earlier, it had been selling roof beams for food, and it set up an institution to finance irrigation schemes and roads and power stations in 99 other countries. Through the 1960s and 70s, Kuwaiti foreign assistance averaged more than 5% of national output a year. There is no comparable figure among wealthy states. Then came the decision that mattered most. It is 1976. Sheikh Jaber Al-Ahmed Al-Jaber Al-Sabah, who had built the Kuwait Fund as finance minister and is now the ruler, issues a decree that splits the country's money in two. One pot, the General Reserve Fund, receives the oil revenue and pays for the state. Budgets, salaries, hospitals, subsidies. It is the working account. The second pot is different. The Reserve Fund for future generations is seeded with half the balance of the first, and from that year forward, it takes a fixed share of all state revenue every year, automatically. 10% later raised. Not what is left over, not what the budget can spare. A first claim, taken off the top before anything else is paid. And it cannot be spent. Not by the government, not by the ruler. Withdrawing from it requires an act of the National Assembly. The name is exact, and it is not decoration. The fund is not for Kuwaitis. It is for Kuwaitis who have not been born. A country whose entire visible wealth came out of the ground had written into law the assumption that the ground would empty. The fund was tested once before anyone crossed a border. In 1977, Kuwait opened a properly regulated stock exchange. Almost immediately, a second market grew up beside it, unofficial and unregulated, trading shares in Gulf companies registered abroad specifically to avoid the rules. It was housed in an air-conditioned car park that had previously been used to trade camels. Its name was the Souk Al-Manak. It worked on post-dated checks. A buyer wrote a check dated a year forward, took the shares, sold them on before the check came due, and wrote another. Under Kuwaiti law, a check was a cash instrument, so nobody treated the date as a real thing. Credit created itself out of paper. By 1981, the Souk Al-Manak was the third largest stock market on Earth by capitalization, behind New York and Tokyo, ahead of London. In August of 1982, the checks began to fail, and the whole structure came apart in weeks. When the clearing committee counted the paper, it held 29,000 post-dated checks with a face value of about $94 billion. That was roughly 5 times everything Kuwait produced in a year, and about $90,000 for every Kuwaiti man, woman, and child. Every commercial bank in the country, except one, was technically insolvent. The state absorbed it. The central bank put deposits into the failed institutions. A settlement scheme ground through the claims for years, and the recession that followed lasted most of the decade. Kuwait, the country that had saved its oil money first, had just produced the largest speculative collapse per head in financial history in a converted car park. The savings held. That was the point of them. After dark, out past the last streetlight, something small crosses the road and stops. Rupel's fox is a desert specialist, and next to a red fox, it looks like a sketch of one. Sandy, pale, light-framed, with ears far too large for its head. Those ears are radiators. Blood moves through them close to the surface and sheds heat into the night air, which is one of the reasons the animal can live where the ground reads 60 degrees at midday and there is no shade for 40 kilometers. Its feet are furred underneath, across the pads, which lets it cross sand that would burn an unprotected foot. It hunts insects, rodents, lizards, and whatever fruit the desert offers, and like the dove, it can go without drinking, taking its water out of what it eats. It is not the fennec, which belongs to the Sahara and has never lived here, though the two are confused constantly. This is the Gulf's own fox, and it is still working these plains, most of it after dark, most of it unseen. On the 2nd of August 1990, the border was crossed, and by the end of that day, Kuwait, as a functioning state, had ceased to exist inside its own territory. The ruling family and the government crossed into Saudi Arabia and established themselves at Taif. Around 300,000 people left. Those who stayed lived under an occupation that killed somewhere in the region of 1,000 Kuwaitis, through shooting, through detention, and through reprisals. 605 people were taken away and never came back. Their cases stayed open for over a decade. And almost immediately, something happened that was intended to protect Kuwait and very nearly paralyzed it. Governments around the world froze Kuwaiti assets to make sure they could not be reached or spent by anyone else. It worked. It also froze the legitimate government of Kuwait out of its own accounts, which is when the office that had opened in London in February of 1953 became the state. The Kuwait Investment Office had spent 37 years quietly buying equities, bonds, property, and stakes in companies. On paper, it held something above $100 billion. 3/4 of the national gold reserves were sitting in European vaults, out of reach of anything happening in the Gulf. Now, it stopped being an investment manager and started being a treasury. Every transaction at first required individual approval from the Bank of England. The rules were relaxed as the months went on. Through that channel, the London office moved money to Taif, and from Taif, the state kept running. Salaries were paid. Every Kuwaiti government employee, wherever in the world they had ended up, continued to be paid. Students abroad kept their stipends. Medical care was funded for citizens in exile. A scheme was drawn up to lend as much as $90,000 to Kuwaitis living in Europe and Asia who could prove title to property they could not reach. The investment income alone was running at an estimated $150 million a week. The exiled government also spent outward on a scale that is difficult to take in. Around $16 billion was pledged to coalition partners, including $2.5 billion in 1990 toward logistics costs alone, and roughly $3 billion a year to Turkey for closing the overland pipeline. A country under occupation producing nothing was one of the largest single funders of its own liberation. The liberation came in late February of 1991, and the retreat left the wells burning. 605 confirmed fires, by the count of the Kuwait Petroleum Corporation, out of nearly 750 facilities damaged, around 300 lakes of standing crude. Soot mixed with sand and gravel and set into a black crust the engineers called tarcrete, covering something like 5% of the surface of the country. 26 million cubic meters of contaminated soil. Putting it out was slower than anyone expected, and the first obstacle was not the fire. The wellheads had been mined. Every approach had to be cleared by hand before a crew could get within reach of a burning well. There was nowhere to plan from because the government buildings and the hotels were themselves burning or wrecked. And there was no water. In a country whose water comes from desalination plants that were no longer running, the crews were being asked to fight the largest oil fire in history without a supply. The solution was to run the country backwards. The pipelines that carried crude from the fields to the sea were repaired, and then seawater was pumped up them in reverse, inland, into lagoons dug beside the fields. The oil export system was turned into a firefighting water main. 11,450 people from 38 countries worked on it. Red Adair's crews, Boots and Coots, Wild Well Control, and a Canadian outfit called Safety Boss that arrived fourth and capped more wells than anyone else, 180 of them. Kuwaiti crews from the oil company worked alongside them the whole way. Predictions at the start ran to 3, 4, 5 years. It is the 6th of November, 1991. The last well is capped and the last flame in Kuwait goes out, and for the first time in 9 months, there is a normal sky over Al Amadi. Total time from the first fire, 268 days. The bill was on a scale to match, restoring production costs between $8 and $10 billion. Firefighting alone took $1.5 billion. Total infrastructure damage was assessed at somewhere near $100 billion. National output had fallen from $24 billion in 1989 to $10 billion in 1991. It was paid. Some of it came later, through a United Nations commission funded by a levy on Iraqi oil exports, which eventually awarded Kuwait more than $50 billion over 30 years. The last installment settled only recently. But that money arrived years and decades afterwards. The money that kept the country alive between August of 1990 and November of 1991 came from a fund that had been accumulating, quietly, since a small office opened in London 8 years before Kuwait was a country. By the middle of 1992, Kuwait was pumping 2 million barrels a day again, and the marshes at Jarrah began to fill with birds again, as they always do in winter. Greater flamingos come into the shallow pools below the escarpment in their hundreds, standing in water that is barely deeper than their knees. They feed with their heads upside down, the bill inverted, pumping water through a comb of plates and filtering out brine shrimp and algae. The pink is not theirs, it is borrowed from the pigment in what they eat, which is why a flamingo in poor feeding turns pale. They were here before the oil, They were absent, and then they were not, in the years the smoke was clearing. They are here now, in a wetland ringed by a motorway, a power line, and a growing city, standing in water the color of the sky. So what is a country that saved its oil money first, 3/4 of a century on? The Future Generations Fund did exactly what it was designed to do. Together with the Working Reserve, the Kuwait Investment Authority now manages around $1 trillion, which is roughly $600,000 for every Kuwaiti citizen alive. It survived a collapse in pearls, a war, an occupation, and the destruction of its own income stream. It has never been touched for a budget. The other pot has not fared the same way. The General Reserve Fund, the one the state actually spends from, held 33.5 billion dinars in 2015. By March of 2024, it was down to about 2 billion. Kuwait ran deficits totaling some 33 billion dinars across the decade to 2024, and the Finance Ministry projects a further 26 billion in the 5 years after that. Oil still accounts for around 90% of exports and of government income. Two funds sit side by side. One is nearly empty. The other has passed $1 trillion and cannot legally be opened. And the body whose approval would be required to open it, the National Assembly, has been suspended since the 10th of May, 2024, along with several articles of the 1962 Constitution, for a period of up to 4 years. In its absence, a new public debt law was passed, permitting up to 30 billion dinars of borrowing on terms running as long as 50 years. A country holding $1 trillion in savings has returned to the international bond markets to pay its bills. There is a second question the fund has never answered, and it is older than the deficits. Around 100,000 people in Kuwait are stateless. They are called the Bidun, from the Arabic for without, and most are descended from families who were living in the country at independence but did not register, or could not. In 1986, they were reclassified as illegal residents and lost access to state education, healthcare, and employment. Their children inherit the status. And since 2024, tens of thousands of people who did hold Kuwaiti citizenship have had it revoked, in a review of nationality files that has stripped, by some counts, close to 50,000 people in a single year of a status they were born with. A fund named for future generations, in a country still deciding which future generations it belongs to. Perhaps what stays with you about Kuwait is not the $1 trillion, it is that everything here had to be brought in. The water came by sailing ship from another country's river, and now it is manufactured out of the sea. The food is grown on sand that should not hold a crop. Even the ground under Bouyan was carried down from somewhere else. The one thing this place has ever produced by itself is under Bouyan, and everybody has known from the beginning that it is finite. They wrote the word down in 1953. The men who wrote it had watched the pearl trade die inside 10 years, and they built the fund because they did not believe good fortune lasts. They were right about the oil. Nobody yet knows whether they were right about the fund. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until the next journey.